President Trump gave them permission to ban all refugees, but some Republican states, specifically starting with Utah, have said, no thanks, Mr. President, we want more refugees. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, interesting story from the Washington Post, pointing out the fact that this heavily Republican state of Utah has essentially told the president of the United States that they're not interested in banning refugees, and far from it, they're actually wishing they had more. They said they find that refugees make good citizens, and they have programs in place and resources available to help to nurture those refugees coming from places like Somalia, for example, into their communities. The Washington Post interviewed some people who are from those other countries and said even though they expected coming over as dark-skinned people, they'd look like aliens in the largely white state of Utah. In fact, they find it's a wonderful place to live and they're happy to be there. Bill, this is not just Utah. In fact, no state has yet said that it would take up President Trump on his offer to ban refugees. What do you think's going on in these states, most of whom are run by Republican governments?
Well, it sounds to me like just dealing with the case of Utah that you mentioned, it seems to me that the state government of Utah feels that there's room for refugees in Utah. And if all the other states feel the same way, then that means that now, assuming they represent the will of the people, which I'm going to assume is the case, and certainly close to it, then that's telling me that the refugee situation is not as out of hand as it was in Europe. And that was basically what this whole thing was all about. I don't know if the people of Utah were specifying specific refugees or any refugees in general or so on. But if the people of Utah are actually saying, no, bring us more refugees, then that's just terrific. That's great. You can have the country's built on a certain amount of immigration. And I tend to think of refugees, generally speaking, as people who are running away from something rather than running towards something. I think that the people who are running towards something tend to make better citizens. But if the experience of the people in Utah has been a positive one, and they want to have more of it, I think that's great. What I don't like is the federal government giving orders on issues to people in terms of how many they will accept under, as we saw under the previous presidency.
Well, and President Trump, in his defense, did not say that states could not receive these refugees. He just gave them the authority to ban them. And so far, nobody has taken him up on that offer. He was trying to cap refugee immigration to the United States at about 18,000. I think at its height in the Obama administration, it was closer to 110,000.
Now you're on to something. Okay, so if you're basically saying that immigration is a fifth of what it was, or refugee immigration was a fifth of what it was under Obama. And
well,
then
that's what the president wants it to be. Yeah.
Well, okay, but that's what it is. So that's the number that we're dealing with now. That's the number that this story is about. So if President Trump has cut refugee immigration by 80%, and the states are saying, no, we can take on some more people, then this is a win-win-win situation for everybody. What's not a win-win situation is when the federal government, not just our federal government, the governments of Germany or so many of those EU countries you saw back in 2015, when the federal government decides that you're going to take more of these refugees whether you like it or not, and going to destroy neighborhoods whether you like it or not. That's where I have a problem with it. But this kind of thing I think it's positive news. If Donald Trump has reduced the inflow of refugees to the point where states are saying, no, we can handle this, then things are more or less in balance. And hooray for the Republic.
I think you may be putting a spin on it that the story that I read anyway didn't imply, and it's not necessarily that the states are saying, okay, now that you've gotten it down to a manageable level, let's increase the trickle. It's that literally no state has said to the White House, yeah, we'd love to ban refugees. And in some cases, North Dakota was another example, I believe, they're saying, we'd actually welcome these people. We like having these people here. So you're not suggesting that the only conservative objection to this was the numbers, are you?
Well, certainly the numbers are a big part of it. My primary problem with any kind of immigration into this country, frankly, is that it tends to be concentrated in areas and not dispersed out among the population where I think assimilation is better. I think it's better for the immigrants that way. I think it's better for the people who are doing the assimilating as well. What I don't think is particularly good for the country is to find what are essentially internal, refugee communities that are not having any experience at all with the outside community. And Dearborn, Michigan strikes me as an example of that kind of place. But again, if you're telling me that Donald Trump has offered to say to states, you don't have to accept any refugees, I've cut the number down by 80%, but you don't have to take them anyway. And then the states are saying, no, we can handle this. That to me is an indication that we are not in any particular danger given the numbers that we're talking about. And with a country of 320 million people.
You keep bringing that 18,000 figure in as if the whole story is about the fact that now President Trump has got it to a manageable number and everybody's okay with it. That's not what the story is saying. They're not talking about any specific number. They're not saying, hey, we're glad it's down to 18,000. They're in the case of Utah, at least, they're saying we want more refugees. In the case of most other states, nobody is saying they don't want to welcome refugees. And the story points out, by the way, it says, until recently, what's true in the Utah was true for the United States as a whole. From Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, every president in recent decades has sought to bolster that refugee program. Identifying with it was a way to show the world that America is still a great refuge. It built our international prestige and it strengthened the bonds of communities at home. And so you're telling me you just told me that the 18,000 figure has nothing to do with it. But if I told the state of Utah that you're going to accept 18 million refugees, do you think they'd be comfortable with that? How about 180 million? How about if I told them they're going to accept one? So you are saying then that it's the number that the conservatives are upset about. There's a specific number somewhere where we say it would be okay with that number.
Precisely right. And that number it's a saturation number. And the saturation number is the number beyond which assimilation into the melting pot, the entire theory of this country breaks down because there are so many immigrants in one area from the same culture that they don't have to basically become Americans. They can live in these enclaves forever.
Now, in an effort to address this
is what's happened in France, and we see it in these banlieues around France where French citizens cannot go, and that's what Donald Trump is trying to protect us from here. I agree with him, and to say that the number has nothing to do with it is absurd. Of course it does. If you're saying to them, we have 18,000 refugees this year. 3-4 years ago, we had 10 times that number.
I'm not saying that, and let me clarify because this keeps coming up in this conversation, and it's not what the story is saying. I finally found the paragraph that will clarify this. So let me drill down on this a little bit. It says the president in September of 2019 cut the annual number of new arrivals, meaning refugee arrivals, to a maximum of 18,000, a record low. The story goes on to say he's repeatedly attacked refugees, suggesting they may be Trojan horse, essentially bringing terrorists into the country. And he has bragged about how he's cut this number. Now, states have until next June to express to the president whether they want to be part of this ban or not. We're not saying that we've already reduced refugee immigration to 18,000. The president has just set that number on it in September. And so far, nobody's jumping ahead to him and saying, hey, thank you, Mr. President. We're glad you cut that number back. We didn't want any more anyway. And in fact, quite the opposite in some states.
So what this story is basically saying is that Donald Trump is the only racist in the entire country who doesn't want refugees coming into this nation, that despite the fact that he offered to cut them, the states in their generosity and their humanity are going far beyond Donald Trump and his monstrous, monstrous desire to keep anybody who doesn't look like him out of the country. That's what the story in the Washington Post is designed to look like. That's the message that this story is saying. It's a message it's selling. Its message is selling that Donald Trump says the country doesn't want more refugees, and here come the states saying, no, we think they're swell. Now, that is possible in a situation where the refugee influx is under control. Where it's not under control, you don't have that situation. And so you're talking about a situation now where the total number of refugees is at a level that is acceptable to the states and may in fact be below the level that the states think they could certainly maintain. That's what the story is telling me in terms of numbers, but that's not what the story is about. The story is about, as you brought it up, it's about the fact that Donald Trump says there's too many refugees in America, but the states and everybody in the states, every single American citizen says, bring them more. We want more. Now, to the degree that the state of Utah, speaking for the people of Utah, says that we can assimilate more refugees than the ones we're getting, that to me is an indication that it's working on a national level. And if it was 18 million people going into Utah, or 180 million, or 1.8 billion, and I can just keep adding decimal points, there would come a point when the people of Utah would no longer say, hey, we could use some more refugees. We can assimilate some more refugees. So if this number has been cut by 80% over what it was during Barack Obama.
It has not been cut. He has said
it's targeted.
18,000 is targeted for the next year. And I will agree with your assessment of the intent of the Washington Post. I have no doubt that the journalists at the Washington Post had every intention of making President Trump look bad in this context. However, the indication here is that the overall thrust of the story makes it sound like even 110,000, which was the peak during the Obama years, is not going to overwhelm a population of 330 million Americans.
The overall intent of the story, and the reason they picked Utah, is because it's the most conservative state in the union. And what the Washington Post is trying to say is even the most conservative Americans, those lily white Mormons, are not nearly the racist that Donald Trump is. So let's just
exactly
acknowledge that's what the story's about.
I have no argument with you on that.
Okay, so that's what the story's about. Now, the question is about whether or not there are too many immigrants in Utah. And according to this story, there are not. And that's fine. That's good. You don't want the house on fire. You want people to say, no, we can take more people. We can definitely assimilate more people. But the question is, how many more people? And I'm saying that if Donald Trump is, whether it's enacted or not, if his target for 1 year or 2 years from now is 20% of what it was under Barack Obama, that is telling me that the system is now able to breathe. It's able to breathe, and it can actually absorb immigrants and absorb them into the general culture, which means they become Americans and they bring a little bit of their culture to America. And that's how it's always worked.
So here's the numbers that you were mentioning. Utah's population, and I don't know what the total state population is, but I'll give you something that will help you to understand it. Utah's population right now includes some 60,000 refugees hailing from places such as Somalia, the Congo, Syria, Iraq, and Vietnam. Under President Trump, those new arrivals, though, have dwindled from in 2016, they received 1,245 new refugees. Last year, it was down to 421. But Utah, as the paper says, as the Washington Post says, punches well above its weight, taking in more per capita than large states like California, Texas, and New York.
That's because the people of Utah are good, hardworking, conservative people. And out of the kindness of their hearts, not just out of the kindness of their hearts, but certainly their inherent kindness and their inherent decency is why, number one, that they're saying they can take more immigrants, and number two, the immigrants are saying this is really a swell place to live. All right, so this is actually, it's actually making the point opposite the point that the Washington Post wants to make. The Washington Post wants to make the point that Donald Trump supporters are a bunch of racists, and so what they're doing is they're saying Utah's asking for more refugees. I'm saying, you said the number that they accepted was how many? 418?
In the past year, yeah, it was 421, I believe was the number.
421 individuals?
Yes.
And it's a national news story that the state of Utah is saying we can take more than 400 people?
No,
is that what you're saying?
What they're saying is that's dropped during the Trump administration because of Trump administration policies. It's gone down, or at least because of the effect of having Trump as president. In 2016, they had 1,245 new refugees in Utah. Last year, it dropped down to 421. They have the capacity. They want more. And there are literally resources standing by to welcome these new people.
Swell. I mean, I've been to Welfare Square in Salt Lake City, and I've seen the way the Mormons in Utah handle these kind of things. And if they were running the government, we'd be in much better shape now. So again, 400. Look, it's this article. If you read the article the way you read it, it makes it sound like Utah, which was taking in hundreds of thousands of refugees, is saying these people are swell people, despite what Donald Trump says. We really like them. Let's have more. And if you're telling me they took 400 people, and at the peak they took 1,200 people,
that wasn't the peak. That was just 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, so if you're saying that 2 or 3 years ago they took in 1,200 whole people, and now the state of Utah is saying we can handle more than 1,200 people, this isn't a story. What's the story is the headline. The fact that the state of Utah said we can handle more than 400 people is self-obvious. It's self-evident. It is not. That's not a news story. Did the Washington Post article give you the number of people that they were accepting?
They have a total of 60,000 refugees living in Utah right now.
Okay, but it didn't tell you how many they took in last year, right?
Well, last year it said it was 421.
The article said that.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, at least they included that for a change. So again, does 421 people seem excessive for the state of Utah to absorb in a year? Doesn't seem excessive to me by any means. And so what the story is basically saying is Utah is saying we can handle more than the 420 people that we accepted last year. I completely agree with that. There's no question they can. They probably need the labor force as well. So, swell. But that's not what the story is trying to say. What the story is trying to say is that the most conservative state in the union is asking for more refugees in spite of Donald Trump saying you don't have to take any more. Therefore, all of the assumptions that the Washington Post has made about Donald Trump are true. And that's the fact that the story the fact that Utah is saying we can accept more than 421 people this year is not the same thing as the state of Utah saying we can accept more than 4 million people this year. Those are not the same things. Those are not the same stories. Under any circumstances are they the same stories. If you were to take that 421 people and make it 4,200 people, that'd be a 10 times increase. Okay, they probably can handle that too. But what if it was 420,000 refugees? What if it was 4 million? And again and again and again, we come back to the fact that just plain common sense, fundamental common sense, is being absolutely eradicated from this story in order to paint a political picture. And common sense says to me that a state the size of Utah, both in terms of area and population, does not going to have any problem accepting more than 421 refugees in any given year. So for them to say we can handle more people is a signal that the situation is actually working for a change. It's actually working. And they're saying, no, we can handle more people. Okay, so they'll get some more people. That's great. When they get to the point where they say we can't handle any more people, then the question will be, will the president at the time, when they say this, say, well, too bad for you. You're taking them anyway, which is what the previous administration has done and what the entire European continent has done. Said to the people of those countries, a country, Germany had a town with something like 175 people in it total or something. And they introduced something like 450 refugees into that town. And if you don't like it, you can leave, they said to the people who've been living there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. That's the kind of thing that American conservatives are worried about. And
I think part of the implication of the story, Bill, is, yes, that is the kind of thing that American conservatives are worried about, but that's not the picture on the ground in the United States. And in essence, what we're doing is we're taking some sort of, racialist concerns from overseas, transferring them to the United States and making it sound like we're on the brink of becoming that next little town in Germany.
Okay, so let's take a look again, because this whole issue is about saturation. It's all about the ability to assimilate. So let's look at some numbers. That case in Germany was a case where the German federal government said you are going to have 3 refugees in your city for every one person that were natively born there. We're going to bring 3 to 1. So what's the population of Utah?
I would have to ask Google.
Go ahead.
Okay, Google. What's the population of Utah? 3.1 million. Okay,
3.1 million. Now, if we were to take the example of Germany, the example that American conservatives are worried about, that would mean that in addition to the 3.1 million people already in Utah, 9 million refugees.
Well, Bill, you're just making my point.
I'm not making your point.
The point is that that's not happening in the United States. And yet people like you are trying to make it sound like it is happening in the United States.
This is the same thing as saying
it's a present threat.
This is the same thing as saying that airplanes aren't falling out of the sky. Look how safe it is. Therefore, we don't need to have any safety measures in place. What I'm saying is,
we don't need to ban airplanes.
No. This entire argument is designed to paint Americans, it's just another bolt in the machine to produce Americans that are white, racist Americans who have to be just shuffled off to the side in order to move into our progressive future. And I'm telling you that the numbers are what counts, and the numbers do count. They didn't ask Utah to take 9 million refugees for their 3 million population, which is what they did in Germany.
And the story's point is that does not happen in the United States. So making that case is irrelevant.
It doesn't happen in the United States because it is 4 levels or 5 levels of magnitude smaller than what they enforced in Europe. And as I said at the beginning of this argument, That is obviously a number that we can accept. And if Utah says they can accept more, then that's great. That's fantastic. Good. But there's a big difference between saying we can take more refugees and then saying we can't take any more refugees and then the government saying you're going to have to take them anyway. That's the difference. So I don't understand what the fuss is about. It doesn't seem extraordinarily newsworthy to me that the state of Utah can accept more than 421 refugees in 1 year. That doesn't strike me as particularly newsworthy at all. Now, if they said they couldn't take more than 400 people a year, that might be newsworthy. But this is just plain common sense.
Final comment on this part of the story. At an October rally in Minnesota, President Trump's supporters booed his mention of Somali refugees and then cheered when the president announced he had given states and cities the chance to block them from moving in. The president adding, "Believe me, no other president would be doing that." Mm-hmm. That kind of a quote makes it sound like, Bill, it's not about saturation and it's not about numbers, but it's about people from other countries that we don't want to welcome here.
Oh, really? It's just about people from other countries that we don't want to welcome here? It's not got nothing to do with the ideologies that they bring or the morality or the work ethic or any of that. It's just that they're darker than we are. Is that it?
I don't know what you think the crowd at a Trump rally knows about Somalia specifically, but I don't think everybody immediately says, oh, Somalia, well, the population of radical Islamists there is 79%. Do you really think that they're going, oh, well, yes, Somalia, we know that that's a terrorist-rich environment. We don't want to welcome anybody from there.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're thinking. What do you think they're thinking? When was the last time you heard the word?
I think that's what they're thinking.
When is the last time you heard the word pirate applied in a realistic fashion? What was the name that was attached to that? Now, I'm not saying every Somali immigrant is a pirate. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that a society that is so ruined, that is so utterly ruined, that produces whole-scale piracy on the open seas in the 21st century is a society that is not particularly well training its citizens for the kind of life that they're going to have in a country like the United States. And since they're not, then the onus becomes upon the United States. It becomes the United States' responsibility to make sure that these people are living in the way that the rest of the American community is. And that can be accomplished, as I've said from the beginning, so long as those numbers do not become so high that the assimilation vector is higher than remains lower than the whatever you want to call it, the maintaining your cultural identity vector, and you end up with Dearborn. And I don't think anybody wants Dearborn, Scott. I don't think the people in Dearborn want Dearborn. I don't think people in Dearborn, Michigan, really expected that they would be awoken every day by a call to prayer that's broadcast for a 15, 20-mile radius. I don't think that's what they had in mind. So if you're saying that there are aspects of cultures that we don't think are particularly compatible with the United States culture, I would agree. And I would argue also that Islam alone, among religions in the world, alone among all of them, there's nothing about a Buddhist in America that makes a Buddhist have to decide between America and Buddhism. Same thing for Jews, same things for Hindus, same things for everybody except for Muslims, who have to declare their allegiance to one or the other. And when we see some of the things that these Muslim representatives, presumably the best and brightest that are being sent from these countries, when we see people like Omar and all the rest of these people and what they do and who they talk to and what they talk about, this idea that people might be a little concerned about this is not an unreasonable idea. It's not. And the idea that we're going to make racists and bigots out of everybody who's concerned about inviting an antithetical belief system into the United States. And when I say antithetical, let me make sure I'm just perfectly clear about this. My right as an American is to say that Muhammad was a pedophile and a horrible guy. He just wasn't a good guy. That's my right as an American. It's protected under the First Amendment. Now, the Muslims coming into this country, as a general rule, are voting for and wanting to establish Sharia law in their communities. And Sharia law says if you insult the Prophet, you'll have your head cut off. So which one is it going to be? If these communities were not pushing for Sharia law, if these communities were not constantly insisting on bringing the things with them that they were running away from, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. But we are, because they do. And for me to pretend that's not happening, and for you to pretend it's not happening, or Trump to pretend it's not happening, or the Washington Post to pretend it's not happening, is how we get into this trouble in the first place. It's this constant denial of the reality of the situation. And the second half of this equation is our moral and intellectual betters who are absolutely convinced that if they simply fairly report the news, then Americans are going to just go out and grab every Muslim in the country and just beat them to death on the streets with tire irons, which you may have noticed has not happened. Right? It hasn't happened. It didn't happen after 9/11. No, it didn't happen. So I don't want to hear any more about how racist this country is. This country has a right to protect its fundamental cultural foundations. And it's not a question of their skin color. It's a question of the ideology that says that you do not have the right to say this about this guy. And if you do, you will be punished. That is antithetical to the American principle. And it's not unreasonable for people who live in this country to say, we don't mind having immigrants into this country. I just don't want immigrants whose entire frickin' purpose is to destroy the entire system. That's all I'm asking for.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful to the members of BillWhittle.com who have made it possible for us to have these kinds of passionate conversations, to look at the news of the day and put them in the context of conservative principles, of time-tested ideas. And we know that the folks at BillWhittle.com, our members, are not afraid of any question, which is why we conduct this show the way we do. We would also like to thank our friends at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest, who are now going into, I believe it's our third month of partnership with them, as they are coming alongside to support and promote us, and we are promoting what they do as well. You can find a link to the Patriot Post in the description below. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.